Welcome to Talk+Water, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of water with those making waves. My name is Todd Bottler, and I'm your host for Talk+Water. I'm also the principal of Collaborative Water Resolution, which you can find at waterdisputes.org. In addition, I'm editor-in-chief of Texas Water and the Texas Water Journal. Both publications are free. My guests today, or guests, I should say, are Jeremy Mazur and Gabriel Collins. Jeremy, who is a regular on this podcast, as I'm sure you know if you listen to it very often, is the Director of Natural Resources and Infrastructure Policy for Texas 2036. He has over 25 years of work experience with the Texas Legislature and state leaders on water and energy policy issues. Before joining Texas 2036, he served as Director of Government Relations for the Railroad Commission and worked on water policy in both the Texas House of Representatives and the Texas Senate. Gabriel Collins, who I'm going to call Gabe, I've also known for a long time. He is the Baker-Botts Fellow in Energy and Environmental Affairs at Rice University's James A. Baker III Institute for Public Policy. He is a member of the Center for Energy Studies team at Baker and also a lead member of the Water Energy Nexus Thrust at Rice University's Water Institute. He also is editor at the Texas Water Journal. Good for you, sir. Prestigious organization. And Gabriel has a JD from the University of Michigan School of Law, and he's got a bachelor's from Princeton. Jeremy, Gabe, welcome to Talk+Water, and thank you for making time to talk with me.
Thanks for having us here, Todd.
Yes, sir. Thank you for having us.
So, I always start out with backgrounds in water. Jeremy, you've told us about your background before, but if you have any new things or just want to remind our listeners about how you got interested in water, please begin.
Well, I accidentally dove into the water subject just over 2 decades ago when I started working for Representative Bill Caligari from Katy. Representative Caligari was on the House Natural Resources Committee. And when he was appointed as vice chair, naturally, I had no idea what the committee did. But I soon and quickly discovered that it had everything to do with state water policy. And he was on that committee for several sessions. And it was frankly through exposure and osmosis that my interest in water policy and Texas water future began and grew. And from there, I went to the Texas Water Development Board, where I was also the Director of Government Relations. I worked in the Senate for a member from North Texas, where I spearheaded his work in water policy. And I capped off my state career at the Railroad Commission of Texas, which, of course, is the state's oil and gas regulator. But a lot of those oil and gas regulations have everything to do with protecting our water quality and water safety. And so it's been a very interesting 2 decades plus of water policy work. And I look forward to several decades more.
Great. Gabe, how about you?
Absolutely. So my story's slightly different. So I'm a dry land guy by birth and raising. I hail from the Permian Basin. I was born in Midland and raised there in Artesia, New Mexico. So we've always been very cognizant of water issues. But I didn't dive into water professionally until I was actually in law school. It was in 2012, my second year of law school, when you finally get to start taking elective courses. There was a course offered by Professor Noah Hall on water law, and I took it because it sounded interesting, and I knew by that point I was coming back to Texas. And the deeper we got into the course, the more I realized, like, this is something that's going to be more than just an occupation for this semester. This is an issue I'm going to really deal with long term, and that class is where I wrote the blue gold piece that I think brought us originally into contact and communication with each other. And I've been expanding my Texas water work ever since.
So, little common story here. You're talking about law school at the University of Michigan. And so I was at the School of Environment and Natural Resources. I think it was just School of Natural Resources back in the 80s getting my master's. And one of the reasons why I had, picked that program is because Joe Sachs was a professor in the law school at Michigan. And so I got there my first year and I okay, I'm going to try to sign up for this law class. And he had left, that summer he had gone to, I think, Berkeley or something. So anyway, little story there. One of the reasons why I want to talk to you two today is you both have interesting new reports that have just come out and have been published by Texas 2036. And so these reports are about water infrastructure funding and the state's economy. And I'm interested in these reports and what you, have found in these reports. And so if you would, Jeremy, would you start and tell us the title of the report and then tell us about the highlights, please.
So let me back up just a little bit about Texas 2036. For your listeners, Todd, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy think tank. And so we work with both the legislature and state leaders on various policy areas with a goal of making Texas the best place to live and work by year 2036, which is our bicentennial. We at Texas 2036, we view water infrastructure as one of three core pillars to the economic growth and development that is the Texas economic miracle. These pillars include a dependable electric grid, a qualified workforce, and lastly, reliable water infrastructure. And so given how water infrastructure has this direct relationship, this direct bearing on the continuation of the Texas economic miracle, we did these two reports because we wanted to explore this relationship in greater detail, to see what the benefits, the economic benefits are attributable from sustained water infrastructure investments, but also conversely to see what the economic consequences would be if Texas does not invest in reliable water and wastewater infrastructure. So both of these reports, one written by myself here at Texas 2036 and the other by Gabe with the Baker Institute at Rice, explore different aspects of this question of what does water infrastructure investment mean for Texas' economic future. The report that I wrote, which is entitled Foundation for Growth, Assessing Texas Water Infrastructure Needs, provides a snapshot of what the state's two key water infrastructure challenges are, what the costs are for the state's long-term costs for addressing these challenges, what the economic consequences are of not investing in water infrastructure, what the funding gaps are. But our report also includes several very specific recommendations for the legislature to consider when it comes to expanding the state's financial strategy for addressing our long-term water infrastructure challenges. And then the other report was by Gabe, and I'll allow him to talk about his report and what it does.
Absolutely.
All right, Gabe.
Thank you. My report is titled Prospective Consequences of Insufficient Investment in Water Infrastructure in Texas. And the bottom line is we did a very deep set of analysis. We looked at past droughts from the 1950s and 2011 and some of the impacts across sectors. Key sectors of focus were agriculture, energy, municipal use, and manufacturing. The bottom line for listeners is if you're thinking about the potential annual impact in dollar terms of a severe drought, if we had something that was like the 2011 drought, but it went on for multiple years, is you could see economic impacts each year that exceeded the damages the state suffered during Winter Storm Uri, which was a nearly $200 billion loss event. And so it's something here that's, it's really significant. And it was interesting as we go through this because you have kind of the deep, dark story that those numbers tell you. But at the same time, there's an opportunity story buried in this because water infrastructure investment in many ways is an insurance policy. And if you just chose the number of $5 billion per year and you compare that to the underlying size of the Texas economy, which is over $2.5 trillion a year, that's actually a lower percentage rate even than most of us pay to insure our homes each year. And as you invest these dollars, it's not just a cost the way your insurance is. Every $1 billion of investment in water infrastructure, you're potentially creating between 3,000 and 6,000 construction jobs in the short term. And then in the longer term, you're underpinning and underwriting huge swaths of economic activity. Just to give you kind of a takeaway there is 100,000 acre feet a year of reliable water supplies can potentially underwrite $30 billion worth of annual economic activity. So there's huge stakes and also big opportunities here as we work to address these challenges.
Well, let's get deeper into the economic consequences of insufficient water infrastructure investment. Jeremy, you want to start with what your report found?
Well, there's two. We have to set up what the problems and the challenges are. The first is that the state needs to develop a broad, diversified water supply portfolio to prepare for future droughts. And the second challenge is that we need to address the problem of aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems that are becoming liabilities to the communities that they serve. Let's look at the first issue, the water supply issue. Now, the state water plan does a very good job of describing what the economic consequences will be from inadequate water supply investment. We're looking at GDP losses that, after adjusted for inflation, equal about $160 to $165 billion per year by the 2030s and 2050s. On top of that, the water plan prepared by the Water Development Board forecasts that we could see hundreds of thousands of jobs lost in those decades, not to mention a near diaspora of people leaving Texas as they seek economic opportunities and also water elsewhere. When we look at the potential GDP losses alone, annual GDP losses from having insufficient water supplies in the 2030s and 2050s, we see that those losses actually exceed those that were endured in Texas during the COVID pandemic and the Great Recession of the 2010s. And so this is a very good way of placing a marker out there of showing what inadequate water supplies will cause in terms of economic damages if we're hit by a long, severe drought that just places additional stresses on our water resources. The other issue we want to look at, too, is what are the economic consequences of having these aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems? Todd, we've seen these headlines of cities having boil water notices, lots of water loss, trunk lines breaking, communities being without water for hours and even days on end. Our report makes the case that these incidences amount to a bunch of small economic cuts that over time equal a meaningful wound to the state's economy. And what our report finds is that aging drinking water and wastewater infrastructure will cost about $320 billion in state GDP by year 2039. And for comparison, Todd, $320 billion is about the size of our current state budget. And so my report looks, high level, we can see that if we don't have adequate water supplies and we're hit by a long drought, our economic consequences, our economic devastation will exceed that which we endured during the Great Recession and COVID pandemic. And at the same time, our failing drinking water and wastewater systems are going to incur upwards of like $300 billion in economic damages in the coming decade.
Well, that's pretty sobering. Gabe, anything you want to add there about the economic consequences?
Absolutely. As we think about the economic consequences, one of the really key dimensions is thinking about how the structure of water usage has changed in Texas over the last 50 years, really. We actually use less water than we did in the mid-1970s, but the composition, the structure of how we use that is very different. Instead of it being predominantly agricultural, we're seeing a greater and greater share each year that is used by cities and by manufacturing enterprises and by other users that are basically not fallowable. And the reason I use that term is if you're thinking about what a farm in most cases is able to do during a really severe drought, is you're able to fallow that field. There can be crop insurance and other offsetting payments, and then water resources can potentially be directed elsewhere. But if you're talking about a city or a factory, that's not something you can do. And so basically, we don't have the kind of shock absorbers in Texas that we had during 2011 even, and certainly that we had during the 1950s, where one of the ways that Texas made it through the drought without huge disruptions to the municipal and industrial structure was a massive upswing in groundwater usage. And it's very unlikely that we would have the hydrological ability to do that now. And so, we're driving down a road where if we hit a bump, we don't have the same suspension system we had before. And so making these preemptive investments as an insurance policy is a very sound approach.
So, you said something really interesting there, Gabe, right at the beginning about how Texas is using less water. And, a lot of that reduction in use is because we're not using as much water for cooling power plants, especially coal-fired power plants as they're being, shut down. But that, kind of leads into my next question about, what might happen to the Texas electric grid if we don't have reliable water supplies. What did you find with regard to that?
There are risks that are very significant and likely underappreciated. If you look at the power plants in Texas that provide our electricity and you break them down by cooling type, we looked at hundreds of facilities. We looked at EIA data, the energy data from the Energy Information Administration that talked about how those facilities are cooled. And we also verified it by actually putting eyes on those plants, looking at satellite imagery through Google Earth, among other applications. And the bottom line is about 29 gigawatts of Texas power capacity are cooled using so-called once-through systems, which basically mean you have to be situated next to a lake or river, and you're just continually moving very large volumes of water through in order to maintain the thermodynamic homeostasis of your plant and be able to generate electricity consistently and efficiently. The problem, if those water levels start to be affected, is in a worst case, you just may not have enough physical water to run through the plant, which forces you to either significantly derate output or potentially shut down entirely. The other thing that can happen is if your discharge water's temperature starts to exceed what you're allowed to do under federal permitting standards, which are imposed to protect aquatic ecosystems, that can also force you to derate. And then the third dimension that's related to both of the prior two is if you have an area where there's multiple power plants on a common lake or river system, is as the temperature in that water body goes up, both perhaps as a product of higher ambient temperatures and then also the discharges from the plants if there's less water to go around, is that can also force you to derate capacity. The reason this matters so much is Texas has become more and more dependent on intermittent renewables like wind and solar. But what the glue is that holds the grid together and makes this work are dispatchable thermal power resources, which means coal plants, nuclear plants, and gas-fired plants. And if you impair even a small percentage of those during times of high demand, whether that's in summer or winter, you can destabilize the grid. And, as we saw in 2021, the consequences of that can be very drastic.
And this is a really important point, and especially for this legislature. Before February 2021, energy and state electric policy wasn't really a big ticket item in the state legislature or among state leadership. Winter Storm Uri in February 2021 changed everything, literally overnight. After that event, the legislature began to recognize and emphasize the importance of dispatchable thermal generation, such as that coming from your natural gas, coal, and nuclear fleet, in order to provide reliable electric generation. And the legislature's focus for the past 3 years, especially after Winter Storm Uri, is to make sure that we have a reliable, dependable electric grid in order to keep the lights on, but also more importantly, to keep the state's economy humming. It was not lost on anyone in the legislature or anyone that was watching that we lost, hundreds of billions of dollars in losses in economic activity just due to Winter Storm Uri alone. And we were also really well aware that that we came so close to having a catastrophic shutdown of the grid. So the legislature has certainly prioritized electric reliability. What Gabe's report does, in a very unique way, and I should say in a way that's not really been presented before, is it underscores the relationship between reliable water supplies and the dependability of our electric grid. To put it bluntly, if you want to have a reliable, dependable electric grid into the future, you need to make sure that there's enough water supplies to keep those thermal generation plants, your nuclear, coal, natural gas plants, operating in the future.
And one other point to buttress that, and I think what happened in February 2021 with Winter Storm Uri, especially if you lived anywhere in the Texas Triangle, it's still a pretty visceral, vividly remembered experience. That was a 4 to 5 day experience for most of us, and it certainly was unpleasant. When you're thinking about a long-term drought, you can be talking something where these effects could go on for months or even years. And there are ways we will dynamically adapt around some of it. But at the end of the day, if you're removing, even just a substantial minority portion of your dispatchable fleet from, the ERCOT system, that is massively impactful. Like, just to put a dollar figure on it, you're talking tens of thousands of dollars potentially for every megawatt hour of lost electricity load that could have been used by a factory or in homes or for any other set of applications. And actually, the damage numbers I talked about earlier, the biggest potential chunk of that, it's the one with the biggest uncertainty bar around it, but it's also the one that could be the largest single piece of damages would come potentially through electricity system disruptions caused by drought.
And Gabe, there is a fascinating paragraph in the energy section of your report where you talk about how in North Texas there was a natural gas generation plant that had to derate during the drought of 2011, and that plant went offline for an extended period of time. It was a small story 13 years ago during the drought of 2011, but I think that underscores what can happen to our electric grid if we're hit by another long, severe drought, such as the drought of the 1950s, or according to Todd's research, some of the mega droughts that have hit us before, and we don't have enough water.
Absolutely. And this is an area, too, when we're thinking about policy moving forward, into the 2025 legislative session, is one way that you start reducing this dependency as old plants are retired and new ones are brought on is moving more to air cooling. We've seen some natural gas plants now. I'm thinking of at least one down in Wharton County. I think there's some in the Austin to San Antonio corridor that are large utility scale plants that now use air cooling. I think this is something, as we think about our future power grid stability in Texas and managing our water resources, is really important. And there's examples from elsewhere in the world. The one that really jumps out at me from the other areas I work on is what we've seen in China, where coal-fired power is basically the foundation of their system. And what you've seen in recent years is basically west of a certain point in China where it starts to get really dry. New coal plants are still being built, but everything is air cooled. And the precise reason why is to avoid these types of water dependencies that we're discussing the consequences of right now.
Mm-hmm.
I think back to Winter Storm Uri, and about 200 people or so died in the state. But what really keeps me up at night is thinking about a situation during a really hot summer where we're hitting 100 most days, or 105 in a major city, that it was without enough power for AC use throughout the majority of the city for long periods of time. I mean, to me, I kind of look at the history of Texas and I think, well, a lot of the people, or the migration of people to Texas really took off after AC was invented, right? And so, it's more critical every day. And so that's the thing that, kind of keeps me up at night, thinking about a scenario like that.
In Hurricane Beryl gave us a taste of that, at least for folks who live in the Houston area. We were out of power for about a week here where we live, with an undersized generator that couldn't run our HVAC unit. And it's very unpleasant. But if you have folks who are really young or older, have health conditions, that can be lethal. And, when we look at that experience, when we look at the heat-related mortality that you see in the Phoenix metro area in Arizona, for instance, where there's folks who may not be able to access air conditioning. Yeah, no, I think you're talking about a potential mass casualty type of situation if you had big power outages during the hot season that went on for a protracted time.
And the interesting thing that we're seeing here is where the water policy discussion is entering the energy policy discussion, which is now entering the public health policy discussion. And underlying all of this are the extreme weather phenomenon that Texas has endured and is certainly likely to endure in the decades to come. And so we know from the data that we can expect hot summers, we can expect more severe droughts. The question is, do we have the water resources and the electric resources that are needed to protect us from the public health catastrophe that could happen?
Yeah, well, robust water infrastructure is a critical climate adaptation tool. And part of the reason I use those words now is I think we have a political shift underway. And this is something that far transcends the recent election, where there's recognition, not just in the United States, but in many other parts of the world. You see this in China, you see this in India, you see this basically everywhere that is either heavily industrial or has aspirations to become a major industrial economy, and that still has rising energy use and a growing population, is climate adaptation has really come onto the table. And when we think about this crossover between robust water infrastructure and our electricity security, it's no matter what somebody's ideological views are, it's absolutely front and center to that conversation and to the future of Texas.
We've been focusing on the energy sector in terms of water infrastructure, but there are other sectors that would be also severely impacted by unreliable water infrastructure. Jeremy, you want to start off with that?
Yeah, I think when we looked at the drought of 2011, which was our worst one-year drought in recorded history, the price tag that's commonly associated with that drought is about $12 to $15 billion. The majority of those economic losses were endured in the agricultural sector alone. And so, it certainly was an expensive natural disaster as far as Texas was concerned. But when we look at some of the findings in our report at Texas 2036, we see that there's going to be negative economic consequences that first go to the agricultural sector, but are soon endured by other key sectors of the state economy. And Gabe's report has a fascinating sequence of events of what the chain of catastrophe would be, with a prolonged severe drought. I mean, the first canary to fall is going to be your agricultural sector. And then from there, you're going to see losses in municipal, manufacturing, and energy sectors. And Gabe, you're probably better positioned to talk about that daisy chain of disaster than I am right now.
I love the terms. You're making me think of a Megadeth song we listened to when we're working out called Train of Consequences. So I'll describe the train of consequences.
It should have been the report. It should have been the report name.
That's the only time Megadeth has ever been mentioned in this podcast, or probably ever will. So,
I mean, look, it's a semi cousin of Metallica, and they're both good. So it's well worth the mention. But to kind of get to that train of consequences that Jeremy's describing, is you think about the order in which impacts manifest, and then what the magnitude of those impacts are. And what we've seen historically with droughts is the agriculture sector is first in line, and that's probably not surprising. I mean, plants respond within hours or days to changes in climate conditions. And as Jeremy points out, when we look at historical evidence from 2011 and also from the 1950s, if you adjust for inflation, something on the order of 15 to 20 billion a year is a very foreseeable impact. As you start to move deeper into the drought, that's when things really accrue in a bad way. That's where cities start to be affected. It's where manufacturing operations start to be affected. And if it goes on long enough, you risk electricity disruptions, as we've just discussed at length. And then the other thing that's a huge deal for a place like Texas that really prides itself on the growth and dynamism that's so fundamental to this Texas miracle that we talk about. If investors or potential investors start losing confidence in siting operations here, those are huge costs as well. I mean, just to kind of illustrate for you, think about Micron Semiconductor, which had been thinking about siting near Lockhart. There's a whole host of reasons that they ultimately chose upstate New York. But among the 7 reasons that the company actually listed on its own website, water was a big one. And one of the things that transpired after they selected the location near Syracuse in New York is that they didn't think they just needed 20 million gallons per day of water, which is already a lot. And that's the volume they talked about when Lockhart was in the running. They upped that to 48 million gallons a day. And to put that in perspective for listeners, the Vista Ridge pipeline, I believe, can move about 42 million gallons per day. So, I mean, that's one facility. And this is a facility that over its lifetime could have capital investment of over $100 billion. And then you think about all the salaries and contractors getting hired and all the secondary economic benefits that flow from that. And, each time, whether it's a really gargantuan entity like that, or whether it's a whole handful of smaller, fast moving entrepreneurial entities that say, we'd love to manufacture in Texas, but we're not confident in the water supply situation. When you add all that up, that's something that's really bad for us. But again, it's something that with proper insurance-oriented investments in making our water infrastructure better and more resilient, we can ensure that folks will have that confidence to park their dollars and seek their opportunities here.
One of the things we do in both of our reports is that we talk about some of the recent examples in this century alone of what the consequences of insufficient water infrastructure investments have been. Notably, in Australia, there was the big dry between the late 90s and the early 2010s, which cost that country's economy billions in GDP. And we've seen other nations or regions such as Cape Town, South Africa, that was grappling with day zero, as well as in Monterrey, Mexico, which also had a day zero not far from the southern Texas border. We've seen other areas in the globe that have grappled with substantial and severe economic consequences of insufficient water infrastructure. And Gabe, your report points to a couple fascinating examples, one in Mexico with the Altamira manufacturing facility, and the other in Chile, where there were substantial damages and business shutdowns due to insufficient water infrastructure.
Absolutely. In the scale that we operate in the corridor from Corpus Christi to Beaumont, when you're thinking about heavy industry and refining and petrochemicals, far exceeds what you see in coastal Mexico. And I think another, if we're thinking about kind of connection points where what happens in water doesn't stay in water and causes consequences that reverberate all over Texas and maybe even beyond, is you imagine a situation where an acute drought created water problems for our refiners and our petrochemical manufacturers. That is a globally impactful event. We saw this during Winter Storm Uri on the petrochemical side. Those plant shutdowns that happened during that event had global impacts that in some cases endured for months. And the same thing can happen on the refined product side. We think of the U.S. as the world's biggest oil producer. We're also one of the world's biggest refined product exporters. We send barrels of gasoline and diesel and jet fuel to Europe, to customers all throughout Latin America. And, there's really interesting analysis on what the impacts could be. Some of my colleagues at Rice and the Speed Center, for instance, have done this. What happens to the Houston Ship Channel if we had a big Category 4 or 5 hurricane that came and pushed 20 plus feet of storm surge? The short answer is it's absolutely catastrophic in Texas and well beyond. But if you think about a quieter, more insidious shutdown of certain facilities or a derating because, again, you may not be able to get enough water, you get some of those same impacts, and they're very profound.
There's an interesting point, I think, to tease out here, Gabe, is like if we find that we don't have enough water supplies and we look at the impacts, the electricity sector, the grid reliability, the petchem facilities, I think what you're seeing is that, by and large, you're going to see energy prices, not only domestically, but internationally, just go up due to the shortage of supply coming out of Texas refineries, Texas ports, you name it. So if there truly could be an inflationary impact in the energy sector, it would just, that's another one of the downsides of drought that we need to talk about.
Oh, absolutely. And again, as we saw during the recent election, these are things that inflation and the impacts on consumers, you can unleash seismic political forces in reactions as a result of that. Yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting about this actually is when you think about where our most intensive industrial exposure is to water-related risk, it's often at the end of it's at river mouths that terminate in the Gulf of Mexico. If you're in Far East Texas near Beaumont, that area historically has had a much more substantial water supply. But when you think about the Colorado River, you think about the Brazos River, you have some of the biggest chemical and refining clusters on the face of the planet at the ends of those rivers, and they're massively oversubscribed. And I think one of the conversations, and this is just, full disclaimer, it's my personal view, that I hope we spark with these reports is also a more serious conversation about desalination in Texas as a way of really enhancing our water security.
Totally agree with that.
So, we've been talking about the negative consequences of insufficient water infrastructure investment. Let's think about some of the positive consequences. Jeremy, toward that end, what are the opportunities that can flow from reliable water infrastructure?
The point that we're making in Texas 2036, we do have a positive outlook insofar as the reason we're enjoying the fruits of the Texas economic miracle is because a lot of our water infrastructure planning and investment and building has worked to create this foundation that we have for the Texas economic miracle today. And so we know that investment in water infrastructure and planning there does work. The point we make also in our reports is that if you continue to invest in water infrastructure, that lays a very solid foundation that first, as Gabe alluded to, provides insurance against future risks, and those risks being insufficient water supplies or failing infrastructure that ultimately proves to be a drag on the economy. But at the same time, water infrastructure creates a strong foundation for economic growth and development. You can have more water-intensive industries that also expand your tax base move to Texas if you have sufficient water infrastructure.
Gabe, do you have anything to add to that?
I certainly. One of the things, too, when you think about, one is there's just the human well-being dimension, because, I think almost everybody in Texas at some point in the last 2 or 3 years has encountered a boil water notice. And, it's something that in a best case is just a bummer. And in a case where, you actually got sick, or if you had folks with, who pre-existing health conditions or something that, actually really suffered from that, it's a huge issue. So, you start with the human well-being and sort of just in the most raw physical sense, and then you move into our economic well-being. And Jeremy's exactly right. And one of the things that I think is really important to remember here when you think about the kind of economic activity that's underpinned is this isn't like we're rice farming or doing something like that where you need a just really massive amount of water to yield, economic value at the end that may not be gigantic. What we're talking about is something where for every additional 10,000 or 100,000 acre feet of water that you can ensure as reliable supply, this is subdivisions, this is semiconductor plants, this is advanced manufacturing of aerospace. I mean, I always remind folks that want to laugh at Texas for other reasons. I ask them, where do stealth fighters get made? The F-35 is produced up in Fort Worth. All these different kinds of activities that we're so good at. And especially when you think not just, about our perspective here within our own borders, but the role that Texas plays within the United States writ large. I mean, if we're really serious about staying a superpower and reviving our industrial and manufacturing, value chains all across the country, Texas is absolutely integral to that. And having secure, affordable, and reliable water supplies is in turn integral to that enterprise by which Texas can offer so much to the country and to the world.
And I think to add on to what Gabe said, a lot of this economic growth that we're seeing is within very water-intensive industries, such as the petrochemical facilities that Gabe mentioned, data centers, semiconductor manufacturers, not to mention just energy writ large that requires abundant water resources. And so if we want to continue to see the state grow in each of these areas, and I think it's pretty self-evident that the direction of the Texas economic miracle is towards this type of economic growth, you need to have the water infrastructure in place to provide the appropriate foundational support for that economic activity.
Yeah. The other thing I'd add to this, I've probably given listeners the impression so far that I'm all about drilling rigs and concrete and cranes and bulldozers and so forth. The other thing that comes out of managing our water resources better is you think about some of the really critical things that are a little bit harder to value, but have a very real and tangible impact on our quality of life in terms of trying to maintain river flows so that we can have healthy ecosystems all the way down to the Gulf and into the marshes and the estuaries and everywhere else. I mean, I didn't put a price on those in the report because it was a little bit beyond scope, but just as a proxy for the kind of services a healthy coastal ecosystem offers, just simply in terms of protection from hurricanes, look at the price tag on the Ike Dike, which I think now is being discussed at something like $60 billion. And it doesn't translate one-to-one in terms of what a healthy coastal ecosystem might economically be worth, but it at least starts to give you a sense that, these are incredibly valuable things as well. And we really need all of this. And by getting our use patterns and our supporting infrastructure right, we can really do a lot to facilitate things, both on the human well-being side, the economic and industrial side and on the ecosystem well-being side that, in some fundamental ways underpins all these other things.
So, Jeremy, all this costs money, as you know, and kind of looking back in 2023, the Texas Legislature and then state voters approved Proposition 6, which created the Texas Water Fund. So do we have enough money at this point, or do we need more to try to build out the infrastructure that we need for the future that we've been discussing?
The good news is that last session, for the first time in 10 years, the legislature and voters voted to expand the state's financial strategy for tackling our long-term water infrastructure challenges. They created this new fund, the Texas Water Fund, that I would submit is pretty smartly designed in terms of how it can work. And the legislature appropriated $1 billion to this Texas Water Fund that can be used for a variety of water supply and water infrastructure projects. So that's all the good news. The bad news, Todd, is like that $1 billion, as everyone in the water sector says, is just a drop in the bucket of what the state needs to invest long-term in our water infrastructure challenges. And what we break down in the Texas 2036 report is what the inflation-adjusted state price tag is for addressing these issues. And I need to emphasize the fact that we've adjusted these cost estimates for inflation. The 2022 state water plan projected that we would need to have about $48 billion in state financial assistance over the next 50 years for state water plan projects. Those were in 2018 dollars. And when we update those figures to 2024 dollar values, we see that the state actually needs to spend $59 billion over the next 50 years on water plan projects. The same is true when we look at the cost estimates provided by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for fixing our aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems. The inflation-adjusted EPA cost estimates are approximately $74 billion for aging drinking water systems and just over $21 billion for our aging wastewater systems. So when you combine all of these figures, the inflation-adjusted state water plan cost estimate and the inflation-adjusted EPA estimates, we see that the state will have to spend about $154 billion over the next 50 years on our water infrastructure needs. The good news is we do have some financial assistance programs that are going to work in the coming years to provide some financial assistance, but they're going to fall well short of providing this $154 billion that we need to invest. And so our report projects that we're looking at a $113 billion funding gap when it comes to long-term water infrastructure needs.
Gabe, do you have anything to add about those long-term costs?
Absolutely. So when you think about what we would invest to offset some of these things that we've talked about here, some of these different challenges, is for certain types of critical public infrastructure, you think about roads, you think about broadband internet systems, and I think water is absolutely in this mix. When you do those things and you already have all the other right ingredients around it, you get a return on an investment that's a multiple of each dollar that's put in. I mean, you think about, again, some of the studies that Jeremy was referencing, like the one in Chile there, they talked about an 8-to-1 return in terms of resilience investments that help you deal with the drought. And so I think that's a really important point to keep in mind here is it's very easy to just immediately push all this over to the expenditure side of the spreadsheet. But I think what has to really be thought about carefully is the return on investment. That one is by doing this period, it's really being a good steward of the resources that Texas taxpayers are, entrusting policymakers with. And then the second thing to think about is these costs and burdens that Jeremy's talked about and that I've talked about. these are not distributed evenly over time. You see almost a bulge if you're looking at the 2030s and into the 2040s in particular. And the costs don't go down over time. And I think there's also a case when you think about the urgency here of getting to work right away and starting to make repairs instead of waiting until something is so broken that you have the disruption and then you have to rebuild everything. That there's a huge value in being proactive and preemptive, and we have that opportunity in front of us now.
And it also, Gabe, to your point, it also mitigates risks. I mean, as you guys point out in this report, this is a form of insurance for the state. I mean, investing in water infrastructure is a form of insurance for the state that potentially mitigates the impacts from future known risks, such as long, severe droughts.
And you instill confidence. Confidence, I mean, when we think about what are the most important, humanity's most important intangible commodities, time is probably number one. If you're trying to grow and prosper, confidence is number two. So much of what we do, whether you're investing money in a stock, whether you're investing in a building, or whether you're thinking about, moving to a new place and doing something different or staying where you are, so many of these things boil down to confidence, which, is one of the most profound human feelings and emotions. And one of the ways that we bolster that and reinforce it is through these investments we're talking about in the water infrastructure throughout Texas.
And I think you see, of course, civic confidence insofar as you have the reliable water infrastructure to keep people's taps flowing, but also see the economic confidence. I remember when the legislature and voters approved Proposition 6 in 2013, creating the State Water Implementation Fund for Texas, a lot of the credit ratings agencies, such as Fitch and Standard & Poor's, rated this action as credit positive for the state because they were being proactive and forward-thinking in the state's financial strategy for addressing our known water infrastructure challenges.
So thinking about all this, Jeremy, Texas 2036 has probably got some recommendations for the Texas Legislature, which, here we are at the end of November, and they're going to be meeting in January, starting in January. What are you recommending regarding water to the legislature?
We think the time is right to take the state's discussion for how to tackle our long-term water infrastructure challenges to the next level. And so we are borrowing a page from the existing financial strategies that exist for state parks and state transportation, where the legislature and voters have already approved consistent, reliable, dedicated funding streams for state transportation and state parks funds. And these consistent, reliable funding streams have worked to provide a lot of money for transportation infrastructure in particular. Over the past 10 years, there's been about $35 billion delivered to TxDOT so that they can go on building roads, highways, and bridges. We think that this funding model should also be applied to water. And towards that end, we recommend in the report that the legislature consider approving a $1 billion per state fiscal year dedication of tax revenues to the Texas Water Fund so that this could provide reliable, consistent revenues to the Water Development Board for the allocation of needed water supply and infrastructure upgrade projects. But just as we're talking about the need for expanding the state's financial strategy with a reliable, dedicated funding stream for water, and if the legislature does want to move forward with that, they're going to have to update and amend the Texas Constitution that will lead to an election next November. We think funding is important, but we cannot have funding without transparency and oversight. And one of the recommendations we also have in our report is that if we do have dedicated funding for water infrastructure, we need to start measuring what the state's progress is towards delivering more water supplies that we need for future drought times, as well as how many of these failing or at risk of failing drinking water and wastewater systems are we fixing every year? We don't want water infrastructure to be a bottomless pit of infrastructure funding, but rather what we need to do is to assess and measure how successful we are in achieving certain metrics when it comes to water infrastructure reliability.
Gabe, do you want to add anything about dedicated funding and that stream and it being applied to water infrastructure?
Mine, I think, is a bit more of a philosophical point. So I'm about as bullish as you can get about Texas. I'm thankful every morning that I wake up here in this state. And when you think about a bull, it's got two horns, and those horns work together. One horn, which is for water, is the infrastructure we've talked about a lot here. The parting thought I'll leave you with is what that other horn could be that reinforces what we do on the infrastructure side. And that's thinking about the role of water markets in the state, particularly looking beyond the Edwards Aquifer and the lower Rio Grande Valley, where we have two historically very successful markets, and thinking about how those types of structures could potentially work conjunctively elsewhere in Texas to really help us turbocharge this hopefully greater influx of infrastructure dollars that Jeremy just talked about.
And I'm actually hopeful that if the legislature and voters do approve dedicated funding for water infrastructure next session, I am hopeful that this opens a next phase in water policy discussions in Austin, because I think if we solve the funding issue in 2025, there are other bigger questions that we need to address, such as the efficacy of our state and regional planning processes. How effective are we in terms of delivering water supply projects and fixing infrastructure that returns economic value to the state? And also, Gabe, like you said, how are we appropriately valuing water? And I think it's worth looking closely at the water markets in the Rio Grande Valley and the Edwards Aquifer area to see how effectively these mechanisms work to allocate resources and assign a needed value to water in those regions.
Yeah, somebody ought to look at those two water markets.
That is. And I think we should say, Todd, we are. We
right.
think very soon we're on the cusp of releasing a groundbreaking study that you have done on the water markets in the Edwards Aquifer and the lower Rio Grande Valley.
Well, with the help of Gabe, too. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing that out among the public here pretty soon.
Yep, absolutely.
Absolutely. The two horns of the Texas Water Bowl, may they work together.
I'm trying to think of another way we can work in a reference to megadeath, because Todd said that has not been used often in this podcast. But I would like to say there's this great academic article called Mega Drought and Megadeath, which if you ever want to stay awake at night, go ahead and read that one. It talks about the history of mega droughts in the southwestern United States. And the last paragraph, after I read it, it certainly kept me up at night.
We have the power to do something about it. And,
right.
That's the task in front of us here with water infrastructure.
Totally.
And there's a real art to coming up with good titles for papers, too, that stick in people's minds. And so, I'm all for that and all about that when it comes to journal articles. So,
can you put megadeath in this podcast title then?
I can probably put it in the hashtag so that if people are like searching for podcasts about megadeath, they'd come across this.
Yeah.
They might be a little disappointed when they listen to it. I mean, if they are really focused on megadeath, but if they're focused on water infrastructure, they'll really, really like it.
Yeah, that'd be a fun one to explain to our communications departments.
Okay, so let's get to the final question for each of you here. And we'll start with you, Jeremy. How can our listeners find out more about your work?
Hey, thanks for that question, Todd. So we have both of these reports available on Texas 2036's website. you can go to www.texas2036.org/water-future. Again, that's texas2036.org/water-future. And both my report, the Foundation for Economic Growth, Assessing Texas Water Infrastructure Needs, and Gabe's report, Assessing the Economic Consequences of Insufficient Water Infrastructure Investment, are both available to download for free on the Texas 2036 website.
Gabe, how can people find out about your work at the Baker Institute?
There's three fundamental ways that will make it easy for you to find my research and follow my work. One is you can Google, or whatever your search engine of choice is, the Baker Institute for Public Policy, Center for Energy Studies, and my name, Gabriel Collins, and research will come up. The other is a private blog I run called Texas Water Intelligence. That is also a source. And then the third is, if you want to look at my LinkedIn profile or even follow me there, it's Gabe Collins, and you'll see the tagline, I help companies, governments, and other organizations solve food, energy, and water problems, and you'll see my smiling picture. So any of those three will work for you.
Nice. I might have to steal that tag from my LinkedIn page. That's pretty good. Great. Well, Jeremy, Gabe, thank you for joining me today. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Hey, Todd, thank you so much. As always, it's great to be on. Thank you so much for having me.
It's an honor. Appreciate you hosting us today.
Oh, wow. Thanks. You're the first person who's ever said it's an honor, I think.
Well, I think it's an honor, too.
Okay. Well, you start a trend. I like it. I like it.
Yeah, when you bring folks who grew up in the oil field on here. So.
Okay. Well, this has been Talk+Water. My guests today were Jeremy Mazur and Gabriel Collins. Jeremy is the Director of Natural Resources and Infrastructure Policy at Texas 2036. Gabriel Collins is the Baker Botts Fellow in Energy and Environmental Regulatory Affairs at Rice University's James A. Baker III Institute for Public Policy. I want to thank you, the listener, for spending your valuable time on this podcast. And finally, I want to give a big thank you to Anna Huff at the Meadow Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University for getting each of these episodes ready to go. If you enjoyed our discussion, please think about, leaving us a review or a like or something like that. That would be great. And that's it. My name is Todd Bottler. Let's talk water again soon.